There is a moment. Rescuers have studied it. Historians have argued over it for 100 years. When everything that could have gone right finally did. February 16th, 1925. The state of Kentucky. A crew of miners, engineers, and exhausted volunteers breaks through the last few inches of stone at the bottom of a 55-foot rescue shaft and shines a lantern into the darkness below. They find Floyd Collins. He is right there, exactly where he'd been for 18 days. His eyes are sunken. His skin is the color of old wax. His lips have stopped moving. The 37-year-old cave explorer, the best in Kentucky, the man who had spent his entire life reading rock and darkness like other men read books, is dead. He had been alive when they started digging. He was alive when they lost contact with him. He was alive, probably, when the shaft was 40 feet deep, 42, 44. He may have heard them. He may have held on. They were too late by hours, maybe less. This is the story of Floyd Collins, a man who went alone into a cave on a cold Kentucky morning looking for a dream and never came back out. It is the story of the greatest rescue attempt America had ever seen. A nation frozen in front of their radios for 17 days, and the tragedy that should have ended differently but didn't. And it begins, like all the worst stories do, with a single decision on a morning that looked perfectly ordinary. To understand what happened in Sand Cave in January 1925, you have to understand the world Floyd Collins lived in. Because that world is the reason he was in that cave to begin with. The hills of South Central Kentucky, at the turn of the 20th century, were shot through with holes, caves everywhere. Limestone carved by millions of years of water, riddled with tunnels and chambers and underground rivers. Farmers discovered them on their properties the way other men discovered oil, suddenly, and with enormous financial possibility. This was the era of the Kentucky Cave Wars. It sounds dramatic because it was. Cave owners competed viciously to attract tourists traveling toward the famous Mammoth Cave, the crown jewel of underground exploration in the entire country. If you owned a promising cave, you could put up a hand-painted sign on the road, charge 50 cents admission, and eat for the winter. Rival owners weren't above sabotage. Hired hands would stand on the road and redirect tourists away from competing entrances. A good cave near the right road was worth more than the land it sat under. Floyd Collins had a good cave. He had discovered it himself in 1917, beneath his family's farmland. A cathedral of underground formations he named Crystal Cave, with delicate gypsum flowers on the walls and calcite crystals that caught lamplight like scattered diamonds. He spent years developing it, building walkways, stringing lights, dreaming of buses full of paying visitors. But Crystal Cave sat too far from the main road. Tourists came to Mammoth Cave and kept driving. The money never came. Floyd was 37 years old in January 1925. He had spent his entire life underground. As a child, he had been drawn into caves alone, crawling through passages no adult could follow, feeling the particular comfort that certain people feel when the world closes in around them and the noise goes away. He was not a frightened man. He was not a cautious man. He was a man who trusted stone. When a neighbor named Beasley Doyle told him about a promising hole on his property, a small opening in the hillside that nobody had fully explored, Floyd saw his second chance. They made an agreement. Floyd would explore it, expand it, determine its commercial potential. If it turned out to be something spectacular, they'd split the profits. Floyd believed it might connect to Crystal Cave underground, giving him a new entrance closer to the tourist road. He called it Sand Cave. On the morning of January 30th, 1925, Floyd removed his coat, hung it over a boulder outside the entrance, picked up his single kerosene lantern, and dropped into the hole alone. He would never hang that coat back up again. The passage inside Sand Cave was not built for men. Floyd had to get down on his stomach almost immediately, pressing his face into wet limestone, pushing the lantern ahead of him with one extended arm, while the other remained pinned at his side. The tunnel descended on a gradual slope, twisting and narrowing, the ceiling sometimes dropping to within inches of his back. His shoulders scraped rock, his breath fogged in the cold underground air. The smell was clay and water and something older. the deep, mineral smell of a place that had never been touched by sunlight. He had worked in this tunnel for weeks, slowly expanding passages, clearing debris, inching deeper into the mountain. And that morning, by his own account, he had pushed through to something remarkable. A larger chamber, a grotto, the kind of discovery that cave explorers dream about. Whether he was right about what he found will never be confirmed. But Floyd Collins believed, in those last free moments of his life, that he had found something worth finding. Then his lantern began to flicker. A dying flame in a cave is not a minor inconvenience. It is a death sentence. Floyd knew this better than anyone alive. Without light, underground passages become indistinguishable. You cannot tell direction, you cannot tell depth. You cannot tell which shadow is a wall and which is a drop. A man without a lamp in Sand Cave could wander for hours and never find the surface. He turned around and started back immediately. The return journey was tighter than he remembered. He inched through the narrow crawlway on his stomach, pushing through slick clay, the lantern guttering with each breath of underground air. And then, in his haste, in the single unguarded moment that would end his life and change American history, his foot caught a protruding rock. The rock moved. A 27-pound stone, loosened from the ceiling by Floyd's boot, shifted and dropped directly onto his left ankle. In the narrow passage, with one arm stretched ahead and the other pinned against his body, he had no leverage, no room to push, no angle of escape. He tried for what must have been a very long time. He tried until his fingers were bloody and his breathing had gone ragged and the lantern had dimmed to almost nothing. He was trapped 60 feet below the surface of Kentucky, alone in a passage barely wider than his shoulders, pinned at the ankle, face pressed into wet stone in the dark. Nobody on the surface knew he was there. That night, his family noticed he hadn't come home. The next morning, January 31st, a 17-year-old boy named Jewel Estes crawled into the cave far enough to hear something. A voice, thin and echoing, calling for help. He couldn't get to Floyd. The passage was too tight for most adults. But he had found him. Word spread through the small community around Cave City, Kentucky, with the particular speed that bad news carries in tight-knit places. By the time Floyd's brothers Homer and Marshall arrived, a small crowd had already gathered at the cave entrance, stamping their feet in the cold January air, staring at the hole in the ground. Homer Collins was not a man who panicked. He was younger than Floyd, tougher in certain ways, and he knew caves. He went in himself and got close enough to talk, close enough to push crackers and pieces of food into his brother's hands, close enough to see the rock and the angle and the problem. The problem was enormous. Floyd's foot was not simply pinned. In his struggle to free himself, he had shifted the debris around him until he was buried to his waist in rubble. His body pointed head down on the descending slope, the blood pooling in his skull, cold water dripping from the ceiling directly onto his face. One drop at a time. Homer came back up. He organized. He called for help. And over the next 24 hours, what had been a local tragedy began its transformation into something else entirely. The reporters arrived first. By February 1st, journalists had begun making the drive from Louisville and beyond toward Cave City, sensing a story. Among them was a 21-year-old cub reporter named William Burke Miller, sent by the Louisville Courier-Journal on what his editor assumed was a minor assignment. Miller was known to his colleagues as Skeets. The nickname came from his size. He was 5 feet 5 inches tall and weighed 117 pounds soaking wet. Someone had once compared him to a mosquito. The name stuck. Miller arrived at Sand Cave and asked Homer Collins for information about his brother. Homer, exhausted and furious at the growing crowd of useless onlookers, looked at the young reporter and said words that would change both their lives. "If you want information, there's the hole right over there. You can go down and find out for yourself." Miller stared at the hole. He had never entered a cave before in his life. He went in anyway. What Skeets Miller found at the end of that 150-foot tunnel was beyond anything he had been sent to write about. He couldn't see Floyd's face at first. Somebody had placed a small piece of oilcloth over it to protect him from the constant dripping. When Miller lifted it, Floyd Collins, pinned, freezing, delirious with pain, blinked up at him. "Put it back," Floyd said. "The water." Miller placed the cloth back over his face. He stayed. He held Floyd's hand. He fed him milk through a rubber tube. He tried to move the rock with his bare hands. He dug at the debris with bloody fingers for hours and accomplished almost nothing because in that narrow passage, there was nothing to leverage against, nowhere to stand, no way to apply force without the risk of bringing more rock down on the man below. When Miller finally emerged, he was weeping. His dispatches from inside the cave ran the next day across the entire country. By February 2nd, the story of Floyd Collins had jumped from a regional curiosity to a national emergency. Families gathered around their radios each evening for updates. Details of the rescue attempts were read aloud on the floor of Congress in Washington. President Calvin Coolidge sent his personal wishes for Floyd's survival. An English reporter made what was reportedly the first transatlantic telephone call ever placed from Cave City, Kentucky, carrying news of the rescue to Europe. And the people came, tens of thousands of them, from neighboring counties, from neighboring states, from as far as the eye could see. They came in cars and on horseback and on foot, and they converged on a small hillside in Kentucky and stood there staring at a hole in the ground. Vendors appeared selling food and drinks and souvenirs. Campfires burned day and night. The crowds grew rowdy. Fights broke out between locals and outsiders over the best method of rescue. The Kentucky National Guard was dispatched, first to assist, then to maintain order, then simply to keep the mob from collapsing the cave entirely with their weight. Hundreds of campfires burning near the cave entrance were doing something nobody had anticipated. The warmth was melting the natural ice formations inside Sand Cave. Water that had been frozen solid began to trickle, then to flow, pooling in the lower passages of the cave. Floyd Collins was lying in one of those pools. The cold water crept around him slowly, relentlessly. Rescue attempts kept coming. A harness was rigged, and men pulled on a rope attached to Floyd's torso with all their strength, trying to drag him free. Instead, they yanked him upward into the rock ceiling above him. He screamed. The attempt was abandoned. Someone proposed amputation. No surgeon on earth could have reached Floyd in that passage to perform it, and Miller himself later wrote that even if it had been possible, the shock alone would have killed him. Miners began carefully removing rocks from around the trapped ankle, prying them loose one by one, trying to create enough space to slide his foot free. Each rock removed risked triggering a cascade from above. Then came February 4th. A tremor, a sound like the earth clearing its throat, and 60 feet below the surface, a section of the cave passage directly above the tunnel between the entrance and Floyd Collins simply came apart. The collapse sealed the route. Anyone trying to reach Floyd now had to get through a fresh wall of broken stone. Skeets Miller tried. A man named Johnny Gerald tried. He clawed his way through the rubble until a rock fell from the ceiling and struck him on the back, and he pulled himself out and said to the crowd at the surface, "I would not go back in that place if they deed me the state of Kentucky." Lieutenant General H.H. Denhart of the Kentucky National Guard stood before his assembled engineers and miners and said something that had probably been true for days, but that nobody had wanted to say out loud. The conventional route to Floyd Collins was finished. They were going to have to go through the ground itself, straight down. A rescue shaft, 55 feet deep, dug through solid Kentucky limestone by hand, racing against the cold and the water and the silence coming up from below. They started digging. The work was agonizing. The shaft was narrow, barely wide enough for a single man to stand in, and the soil kept shifting, requiring constant reinforcement. They dug through day and night, rotating crews, working by lantern light, trying to move faster than the cold was moving through the rock 60 feet below. Rain came. The mud deepened. The shaft walls threatened to cave in. Engineers argued about how to proceed. Progress that should have taken days took a week. A week became nearly 2. Through all of it, the question that nobody could fully answer was the one that haunted everyone on that hillside. Was Floyd Collins still alive? On February 9th, Homer Collins managed to crawl through a gap in the collapse far enough to hear something. Or thought he did. The reports were uncertain, agonizing, The Kentucky governor issued a statement demanding that the absurd rumors spreading through the crowd, that Floyd was not really trapped, that the whole thing was a hoax to sell land, be put to rest. 5 people had seen Floyd Collins in that cave. He was there. Whether he was alive was another question. An electric light on a long cord had been strung down to Floyd days earlier, coiled around his neck, a faint warm glow in the absolute darkness. On February 11th, that light went out. Nobody knew why. The shaft was 44 feet deep. The rescue team knew they were close. They kept digging. February 16th, 1925. The shaft reaches 55 feet. A crew of miners breaks through the last obstruction and creates an opening just large enough for a man to squeeze through into the cave passage below. Rescuers lower a lantern. They lower a man. He moves through the darkness to the place where Floyd Collins has been lying for 18 days. At 3:42 in the afternoon, the rescuer who reached Floyd emerged from the shaft and gave his report in a voice that the gathered crowd struggled to hear over the wind. Floyd Collins was dead. The medical examiners on scene, the Kentucky National Guard physician and a doctor named William Hazlitt from Chicago, stated their belief that Floyd had likely been dead for 2 to 3 days. Some would later suggest he had been alive as recently as February 14th. The electric light around his neck had gone dark on the 11th. When exactly the last breath left his body in that cold passage is something no one has ever been able to say with certainty. What is certain is this. When the shaft finally broke through to him, Floyd Collins was less than 15 feet from the opening, after 18 days. After the 3rd largest media event between the 2 world wars. After tens of thousands of visitors and National Guard troops and miners and engineers and a 21-year-old reporter who crawled into darkness with his bare hands, Floyd Collins died in a passage barely wide enough to hold his body, alone in the cold, within earshot of the men digging toward him. A nation that had held its breath together exhaled in grief. Skeets Miller, who had spent days underground with the man, who had held his hand and fed him through a rubber tube and prayed with him in the dark, who had made 7 trips into that cave when every other journalist in America stood at the surface and watched. Miller sat down and wrote his final dispatch. Through the hours of agony, he wrote, he kept his eyes on an imaginary ray of light. But the light is dark forever. Floyd Collins was pronounced dead of exposure. His body remained in Sand Cave because the authorities deemed it too dangerous to remove it. His funeral was held on the surface of the earth while he lay 60 feet below it. Homer Collins could not accept this. 2 months later, in April 1925, he gathered a small group and reopened the rescue shaft. They dug a new tunnel to reach Floyd from a different angle, and on April 23rd, they recovered his remains. But the story of Floyd Collins did not end with his burial. Crystal Cave, the cave Floyd had discovered and spent his life developing, was sold by the family 2 years after his death. The new owner, a man with a clear eye for the macabre possibilities of the moment, had Floyd's body exhumed from its grave. He placed the remains in a glass-topped coffin and installed it inside Crystal Cave as a tourist attraction. For years, visitors to Crystal Cave paid to walk past the body of Floyd Collins. It remained there until 1989, when the National Park Service finally intervened and had Floyd buried with dignity in the Mammoth Cave Baptist Church Cemetery, where he rests today. The grave marker is covered in coins and small stones left by visitors who still come to pay their respects. 100 years later, Skeets Miller won the Pulitzer Prize in 1926 for his reporting from inside Sand Cave. He was one of the youngest journalists in American history to receive it. He was offered $50,000 to join a lecture circuit, the equivalent of nearly $750,000 today, and he turned it down. He later said the prize gave him no comfort. He had been in that cave. He had seen what no one else saw. And the man he had tried to save was dead. The media spectacle around Floyd Collins is now studied in journalism schools as one of the defining moments in American broadcast history. It was among the first major news events covered live on radio. It introduced the concept of the ongoing episodic news story, the kind that families gathered around their sets to follow each evening, the kind that drove newspapers to print multiple editions per day. In ways that still echo, The coverage of Sand Cave in February 1925 created the template for every breaking news tragedy that followed. The Sand Cave rescue also, indirectly, helped create Mammoth Cave National Park. The national attention drawn to the cave country of south-central Kentucky built pressure for federal protection of the region. The park was formally established in 1941. Sand Cave is part of it now. The entrance is sealed with a steel grate. The National Park Service does not allow entry. Floyd Collins spent his entire life believing that the next cave he entered would be the one that changed everything. On January 30th, 1925, he was right. It just wasn't the change he had imagined. Thank you for watching until the end. The story of Floyd Collins is one that has stuck with me for a long time. Not just because of how it ended, but because of what it reveals about how we respond to tragedy as a society. The courage of people like Skeets Miller, who crawled into the dark because no one else would, and the thousands of others who showed up at that hillside in Kentucky, genuinely hoping to help. If this kind of storytelling matters to you, consider joining our Patreon or becoming a channel member. Your support is what allows us to research and produce videos like this one at the level they deserve. Next time, we go deeper into one of the most terrifying true survival stories ever documented. A story that begins in a tunnel, takes a turn nobody saw coming, and ends in a way that changed how we think about risk, human endurance, and the price of ambition. You will not want to miss it.